Samantha Lewis was excited to move into her new apartment on the top floor of an aging, 20-story building in the heart of the city. The building itself had a peculiar charm, an architectural relic with rusted iron balconies, tall arched windows, and faded signs that hinted at its former glory. Despite its worn appearance, Samantha felt that her new place had character, and she was drawn to the promise of isolation and quiet high above the city streets. The price was a steal, and the idea of having such a high vantage point thrilled her. She wasn't particularly superstitious, though she knew the building was rumored to be haunted. She had always dismissed such tales as fodder for local gossip, a small price to pay for an otherwise perfect space. From the moment she set foot in the building, however, something felt slightly off. The lobby was dimly lit, with flickering bulbs casting shadows over dusty, vintage furniture and cracked tiles. The security guard, an elderly man named Joe, gave her a curt nod, his eyes barely meeting hers. He seemed both uninterested and slightly wary, which struck Samantha as odd. He handed her the key without much conversation, only muttering as she walked away, "Stay in your room after dark, miss. It's safer." She shrugged off his cryptic warning as an attempt to scare a new tenant and rode the creaking elevator up to the 20th floor. The elevator rattled with each floor it passed, groaning under the weight of its years. But Samantha figured it was simply part of the building's charm. Her new apartment was small but cozy, with just enough room for her to set up a studio space by the window. The view of the city skyline at sunset was breathtaking, the lights flickering on as dusk settled over the city, making her feel both elevated and removed from the world below. That night, she unpacked her belongings and settled in, deciding to stay up late to finish setting up her art supplies and arrange her furniture. The entire building was quiet, and the walls seemed thick enough to drown out any noise from neighboring apartments. She enjoyed the silence, feeling more at ease in her solitude. Just as she was about to go to bed, however, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere in the building. It was subtle at first, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the walls, but as she stood still and focused, the sound grew clearer. It was the unmistakable creak of footsteps, deliberate and steady, as if someone were pacing the hallway outside her door. Samantha's heart quickened as she remembered the security guard's warning, but she brushed it off, thinking it might just be an insomniac neighbor or even a trick of her imagination. Still, the thought unsettled her. She peered through the peephole in her door, but the hallway was empty, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast eerie shadows against the faded wallpaper. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had sensed her watching. Samantha shivered, telling herself she was simply tired, and went to bed, pulling the covers up tightly around her. But sleep did not come easily. She lay in bed for hours, every creak of the floorboards and hum of the pipes amplified in the darkness. She felt as though she was being watched, though every time she opened her eyes, the room was still. Over the next few days, Samantha's unease grew. She noticed other strange occurrences in the building, small things that defied explanation. Objects in her apartment would appear in different places than she remembered leaving them. Her favorite mug, which she always left by the sink, turned up on the kitchen table one morning, filled with cold coffee she hadn't made. Her sketchbook, which she kept on her desk, appeared in the hallway outside her apartment one evening. At first, she tried to laugh it off, telling herself she was just forgetful, but the incidents became too frequent to ignore. She started locking her door at all times, though the strange occurrences continued. One evening, as she sat sketching by the window, Samantha noticed something unusual in the building across the street. She could see into a few of the apartments, some lit, some dark, and she absent-mindedly watched people going about their lives. But then she saw something that sent chills down her spine. In one of the windows, directly across from her, a figure stood staring back at her. It was hard to make out any details, as the room was poorly lit, but she could sense the figure's gaze fixed intently on her. She blinked, and the figure was gone. That night, Samantha lay in bed, her mind racing, replaying the scene over and over. She could still feel that unsettling gaze, as though it had penetrated through the glass and followed her back into her room. Her Her sleep was broken by a new sound, the unmistakable sound of doors slamming, one after another, as if the building itself was alive and unsettled. She listened, paralyzed with fear, as the slamming grew louder, each door seeming closer than the last. She knew the security guard was downstairs, but the thought of leaving her room terrified her. The next morning, she decided to confront Joe, hoping he could explain the strange noises and the eerie atmosphere of the building. She found him sitting in the lobby, staring out the front doors, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. When she mentioned the footsteps, the slamming doors, and the figure she had seen, he glanced at her with tired, hollow eyes. "You're not the first one to notice them," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "This building, it has its own way of holding on to people." Samantha pressed him for more information, but he refused to elaborate, only repeating his cryptic warning, "Stay in your room after dark." Frustrated, Samantha returned to her apartment, feeling trapped between wanting to understand the mysteries of her new home and a growing sense of dread. As she entered the elevator, she noticed something strange. A small, faded piece of paper taped to the wall with a single word written on it: "Run." Samantha stared at the note, her pulse quickening. She looked around, feeling the building close in on her. The elevator shuddered as it reached the 20th floor, and the doors opened slowly, revealing the empty hallway bathed in eerie, flickering light. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out and hurried down the hall, determined to ignore the slamming doors and strange sounds. But as she reached her door, she felt a chill wash over her, a sense that someone, or something, was watching, lurking just out of sight. After the encounter with the note in the elevator, Samantha could no longer shake the feeling that the building held secrets meant to be left undiscovered. Every nerve in her body urged her to move out, to escape while she still could. But a part of her was also fiercely curious, drawn to the mystery in a way she couldn't explain. She was an artist, after all, and sometimes the eerie, the strange, the unsettling were the very things that fueled her creativity. Yet even her fascination with the unknown couldn't keep her anxiety at bay for long, and she found herself lying awake each night, listening intently to the old building's many sounds. The sounds of doors closing had started quietly enough, barely audible through the thick walls. At first, they seemed random, just occasional thumps she could dismiss as neighbors coming and going at odd hours. But soon, the pattern grew disturbingly clear. The doors would begin slamming at midnight, every night without fail, one after another in perfect succession. She could track the sound moving down the hall, a slow and deliberate procession, as if each door was part of a ritual that she was never meant to witness. Sometimes, she could almost hear the soft pad of footsteps that accompanied the slamming, but no one ever appeared in the hallway when she peered through her peephole. After a week of restless nights, Samantha resolved to try and understand what was happening, despite Joe's warning to stay in her room after dark. She wasn't the type to sit idle, and a simmering frustration brewed inside her every time she heard those sounds and did nothing. She told herself it was ridiculous to feel so afraid in her own home. So, one night, she waited in the dark by her door, watching the clock inch toward midnight, her pulse pounding with each passing second. The first slam came on schedule, sharp and resonant, echoing through the building. Samantha held her breath, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. The second slam followed, then the third, each one louder than the last, moving closer to her apartment. She could almost feel the vibrations in the floor, as though the entire building was shuddering under the force. She wondered if any other tenants were awake, if they heard the same thing she did, or if she alone was cursed with this strange awareness of the building's nocturnal rituals. As the final door slammed just outside her apartment, she gathered her courage and twisted the knob. Slowly, she cracked the door open and peered into the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. No one was there, yet the hallway lights flickered erratically, casting ominous shadows that seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. She stepped into the corridor, shivering as a cold draft blew past her, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent that made her skin crawl. The emptiness of the hallway stretched out before her, silent and foreboding. Samantha cautiously crept down the hall, listening for any trace of movement, her footsteps barely making a sound on the faded carpet. She felt as if she was intruding on something sacred, trespassing in a place meant only for shadows and whispers. She reached the end of the corridor, where a stairwell led down to the lower floors. The air here was thick and stale, tinged with a strange, sweet odor that reminded her of decaying flowers. She hesitated, debating whether to descend, but a morbid curiosity compelled her forward. As she took her first step down the stairs, she heard a faint whisper, so soft she thought she might have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, a voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "Why did you leave your room?" it murmured, sending a jolt of fear down her spine. Samantha froze, her hand clutching the railing as she scanned the shadows, her pulse racing. She wanted to run, to bolt back to her apartment and lock the door, but she couldn't move. It was as if the voice had paralyzed her with its icy grip. The whisper grew louder, closer, becoming a cacophony of voices, all asking the same question in eerie unison. "Why did you leave your room?" Samantha clamped her hands over her ears, but the voices only grew louder, reverberating inside her skull. She backed up, stumbling up the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive presence that seemed to envelop her. When she reached her floor, she bolted down the hall and threw herself back into her apartment, slamming the door behind her and locking it with trembling hands. Breathing heavily, she leaned against the door, her mind racing. She tried to make sense of what she'd heard, but the memory of the whispers sent waves of dread crashing over her. She wondered if the building was haunted after all, if the stories she dismissed as mere legends held some dark truth. Every instinct told her to leave, to pack her things, and never return, but a stubborn part of her resisted. She just moved in. Running away felt like admitting defeat, and Samantha wasn't one to back down so easily. In the quiet that followed, she sank on her bed, her thoughts spiraling. As she stared at the ceiling, her eye caught sight of a faint stain on the wall near the vent, a dark patch that hadn't been there before. It looked like a water stain at first, but as she studied it, she realized it was something else entirely, a reddish smear that looked unsettlingly like dried blood. Her stomach turned as she traced the shape of the stain, and for a moment, she swore it formed the outline of a handprint. Samantha spent the rest of the night in a sleepless daze, her mind plagued by the voices and the unshakable feeling of being watched. When morning came, she tried to convince herself it was all just a bad dream, an elaborate trick of her imagination. But deep down, she knew there was something very wrong with the building. The echoes of the night lingered in her mind, haunting her every thought, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence there was not only unwelcome, but dangerous. In the light of day, the events of the previous night seemed to dull, taking on the hazy quality of a nightmare. But Samantha couldn't ignore the stain near the vent or the bone-chilling whispers that still echoed in her mind. She went about her day with a restless unease, glancing over her shoulder every time she heard a noise in the hallway and jumping at the slightest creak of the old pipes. The building was ancient, she reminded herself, prone to strange noises. Still, the events had disturbed her deeply, gnawing away at her resolve to stay. Determined to get answers, Samantha made her way to the security desk in the lobby that afternoon. Joe was there, his tired eyes barely lifting to meet hers as she approached. She hesitated, wondering if he would even listen, but her need for answers outweighed her fear of sounding irrational. She leaned on the counter and lowered her voice. "Joe, what's going on in this building? I heard voices last night, doors slamming, people walking down the hall at midnight. Is this place haunted?" Joe's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. He let out a weary sigh and finally looked up at her, his face lined with age and something that looked remarkably like guilt. "Miss Lewis," he began in a gruff voice, "there are things in this building that can't be explained, things better left alone. The top floors, they've had strange occurrences for as long as I've worked here. Tenants leave, new ones come, but those who stay too long, He broke off, his gaze dropping to the floor. Some people say it's haunted, others say it's cursed. I say it's something that should be respected and left alone. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine, but she wasn't about to back down. Respected? Joe, I don't even know what it is. If I'm going to stay here, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Her voice was firm, masking the fear she felt inside. Joe looked around the empty lobby, his face conflicted, before he finally leaned in closer. The building used to be something else, an asylum, back in the early 1900s. They say they kept patients in the upper floors, locked them away from the world. Some of them were dangerous, or so they claimed. No one knows exactly what went on, but those patients never left. They died there, trapped and alone. When the place was converted into apartments, they say the spirits of those people stayed behind, stuck in a loop, haunting the building they were never allowed to leave. Samantha felt a wave of nausea. The image of trapped souls, endlessly pacing the same halls, added a dark weight to the already grim ambience of the building. So, the doors slamming at midnight, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Maybe it's just the building settling, Joe said, his tone skeptical even as he spoke the words. Or maybe it's something else. All I know is that when you hear those doors, it's best to stay put. Don't open your door, don't wander. And for heaven's sake, don't go into the stairwell. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The stairwell. The same one where she'd heard the whispers, where she'd felt the oppressive presence urging her to turn back. She had been inches from venturing further down into its depths the night before, and now the thought of it filled her with dread. But her curiosity was as relentless as her fear. Why not the stairwell? Joe's gaze grew distant, his voice dropping to a barely audible murmur. The stairwell doesn't always go where it's supposed to, he said, his words cryptic yet terrifying. Sometimes people go down those stairs and don't come back the same. If they come back at all. That evening, as Samantha returned to her apartment, her mind raced with Joe's words. Despite the fear growing in her heart, a part of her burned with curiosity. What could possibly be lurking in the stairwell? What could make it change, as Joe had hinted? The more she thought about it, the more the questions piled up, crowding her thoughts and eclipsing her fear. As the hours ticked by, Samantha couldn't help but wonder if Joe's words had been an exaggeration. She decided to test her courage. She'd explore the stairwell, just a little, to see if there was any truth to his ominous warnings. Armed with a flashlight and a determination that masked her terror, she waited until midnight, when the building was silent and still. The hallway was empty when she emerged from her apartment, and she tiptoed to the door that led to the stairwell. She paused, hand trembling on the cold metal handle. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door slowly, casting her flashlight into the stairwell. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the worn, concrete steps and rusty railings. The stairwell looked just as it had during the day, but an unshakable dread lingered, as if something was hiding in the shadows waiting. Samantha took one step, then another, descending slowly. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. After a few flights, she paused, her heart pounding. She felt disoriented, as though she had gone much farther than she should have. The stairwell twisted and turned, feeling endless, with no exit doors on the landings. Panic began to set in as she realized she had no idea how far down she had come, or if she could find her way back up. Desperation clawed at her as she turned to go back, but the stairs seemed to stretch impossibly upwards, as if they were moving of their own accord. Just then, she heard it, a faint whisper, a voice coming from below, beckoning her in a low, rhythmic chant. She could barely make out the words, but the message was clear. Keep going, keep going. Samantha froze, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering onto the steps below. In the brief moment before it rolled out of reach, she caught sight of something in the shadows, a pair of eyes, glistening in the darkness, watching her with a malevolent intensity. The stairs seemed to warp and shift under her feet, spiraling down into a yawning chasm that defied logic and space. She stumbled, gripping the railing tightly, as a surge of cold air swept past her, carrying with it the smell of decay. She forced herself to climb back up, each step feeling heavier than the last, the voices growing louder, angrier, as though they resented her escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she burst through the door to her floor, slamming it shut behind her. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, her heart racing as the voices faded, leaving only the hollow silence of the hallway. That night, as she lay in bed, trembling with exhaustion, Samantha realized that the building was no ordinary place. It was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that she could no longer ignore. She knew now that she had crossed a line, and the building wouldn't let her forget it. The night after Samantha's unsettling encounter in the stairwell, a thick blanket of exhaustion settled over her. Yet, despite her body's weariness, her mind remained sharp and alert, unable to relax in the dark confines of her apartment. She lay in bed, her thoughts replaying Joe's cryptic warning and her own harrowing escape. Her room felt different now, less of a sanctuary and more of a prison. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every creak of the floorboards sent her heart racing, and the once familiar walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There was no hiding from the sense of being watched. It felt as though invisible eyes followed her every movement, waiting for her to slip up. Determined to understand the mystery of the building, Samantha spent the following morning studying the layout of the old place, scrutinizing the strange, unsettling patterns etched into the wallpaper, the faded murals on certain floors, and the unusual symbols carved into the handrails of the stairwell. Each small detail added to her suspicion that the building was more than it seemed, as if it was a place with purpose, designed not just to house people, but to trap them. After hours of pacing the hallways and taking note of every oddity, she came across a door on the 5th floor, slightly ajar. She hadn't noticed it before, and when she peered inside, her heart skipped a beat. The room beyond looked like an old storage closet, filled with ancient filing cabinets covered in dust, each labeled with numbers corresponding to apartment units. She flipped through the files, her hands trembling as she scanned the faded documents. Some were decades old, but they all bore similar entries. Names, dates, and cryptic notes about temporary occupancy or restricted access. One name caught her eye, Mr. Frederick Cole, who had lived on the 15th floor. According to the records, he had moved in nearly 30 years ago, yet there was no indication that he had ever left. The line for his departure date was blank, only marked with an ominous note, last seen during the annual inspection. The discovery unsettled her, but it was the file for her own apartment that left her truly shaken. She found it tucked away in the back, as if hiding from her. It contained little more than her name and the date she had moved in, but in the corner of the document, a faint pencil mark read, "Unaware." The single word hung in her mind, filling her with dread. Had someone anticipated her curiosity? Was she being monitored, her every move tracked and documented like those before her? That night, her anxiety was a constant hum under her skin, a tingling sensation that kept her alert. As the clock approached midnight, she sat in her darkened apartment, listening intently for the familiar sound of doors slamming down the hallway. But instead of the usual echoes, a new sound filled the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. The sound moved, traveling from one end of her apartment to the other, as though someone were pacing on the other side of the wall. She pressed her ear against the cold surface, listening, straining to make sense of the pattern. It seemed to follow a deliberate sequence, almost like a code, tapping in steady intervals before pausing, then resuming. Unable to resist, Samantha tapped back, a quick 3-tap reply. She waited, her heart pounding, and for a moment, there was silence. But then, the tapping resumed, faster this time, as though it were growing impatient. Suddenly, a new sensation washed over her, an awareness that she was not alone in the room. She whipped around, her eyes darting across the darkened space, but saw nothing. Just shadows cast by the streetlights filtering through her blinds. Yet, the feeling persisted, and with it came an urge to look out the window, as if compelled by an invisible force. She approached the window cautiously, pulling back the blinds just enough to peer outside. At first, she saw nothing but the usual street below, dimly lit by flickering lamps. But then, her gaze drifted up to the building across the street, and she froze. In a row of dark windows, one stood illuminated, and in its glow, she could make out several figures standing still, staring directly at her. They were motionless, silhouettes without detail, their heads tilted slightly as if studying her from afar. Cold dread washed over her, and she felt her knees weaken. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. The moment she stepped away, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Why did you look?" Her fingers trembled as she read the text, the words burning into her mind. She wanted to ignore it, to pretend it was a mistake, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She typed a shaky reply, "Who are you?" but no response came. The message stared back at her, filling her with a sense of dread, so profound it felt as though it would consume her. The tapping resumed, louder and more insistent, now coming from all directions, as if the entire building was alive, each wall vibrating with urgency. Samantha curled up on her bed, covering her ears, trying to block out the sounds, but they only grew louder. She knew it was only a matter of time before whatever haunted the walls of this building would come for her. As dawn finally crept in, the tapping stopped, leaving her apartment in utter silence. She drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams plagued by the image of the watchers in the window, their dark eyes boring into her soul. When she awoke, she felt like she hadn't slept at all. She spent the day in a daze, her mind replaying the previous night's events. She knew she was nearing the edge of something, teetering between reality and a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Desperate for clarity, she headed back to the 5th floor and the storage closet. She had to find out more about the other residents, the ones whose files she hadn't checked. But when she arrived, she found the door locked, a heavy padlock now securing it. It hadn't been there before, and she knew it was no coincidence. Someone didn't want her to keep digging. Someone knew she was getting close. As she stood in front of the locked door, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Some doors should remain closed. Samantha backed away, her skin prickling with terror. She turned to leave, but a low voice echoed from down the hall, calling her name in a whisper that chilled her to the core. She spun around, but the hallway was empty, stretching out before her in ominous silence. In that moment, Samantha realized the full gravity of her situation. She wasn't just living in a haunted building. She was trapped within its walls, surrounded by watchers who seemed to know her every move. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. But one thing was clear. Whatever secrets the building held, it was determined to keep them hidden, and it would stop at nothing to ensure she remained unaware, just another name in a forgotten file. As Samantha tried to return to normalcy, the sense of dread lingered, wrapping itself around her like a fog she couldn't shake. Every small sound, every creak in the floorboards or sigh of the old building seemed magnified in her ears. She hadn't received any more messages from the unknown number, but she couldn't stop glancing at her phone, half expecting the screen to light up with another cryptic warning. The knowledge that someone or something had been watching her left her unsettled. She began to feel the weight of the building itself pressing down on her, as if the walls were closing in, subtly pushing her toward an inevitable discovery. One evening, hoping to quiet her thoughts, Samantha ran a hot bath. She poured in lavender-scented oils and tried to relax, letting the steam cloud the room. As she sank into the water, she closed her eyes and tried to focus on the warmth, but her mind kept wandering back to the strange occurrences. Why had her name been in that old storage file? Who else knew about the people in the 15th floor windows? She had so many questions, and every new mystery seemed to lead to more. Just as she began to feel the edge of relaxation, a faint sound reached her ears, an odd, gurgling noise coming from the pipes beneath the tub. Samantha sat up, holding her breath. The sound grew louder, shifting from a low hum to a strange, pulsing rhythm, as though something were moving through the plumbing. She leaned closer to the drain, trying to make sense of it, and suddenly she heard it, a voice, muffled and distant, but unmistakable. She froze, her heart hammering. It was someone's voice, whispering her name. Terrified, she yanked herself out of the tub and grabbed a towel, wrapping it tightly around her. She listened, waiting for the voice to return, but only the usual hum of the pipes answered her. She felt like she was losing her mind. Every logical part of her brain screamed that it was just an echo in the plumbing, maybe a neighbor's voice carrying through the thin walls. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The building was communicating with her, or maybe something within it was. Unable to shake the unease, she spent the next few hours pacing her apartment. She tried to distract herself by watching TV, but her eyes kept drifting back to the bathroom door, half expecting to hear the voice again. As midnight approached, she couldn't take it any longer. She decided to investigate the pipes themselves. Perhaps, she thought, if she found where the sound had come from, she could rationalize the experience, convince herself that it was just a fluke. Armed with her flashlight and a shaky resolve, she ventured down to the basement, where the main plumbing lines were housed. The basement was a labyrinth of dimly lit hallways, filled with the smell of mold and damp concrete. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, twisting and turning, disappearing into the darkness. She followed the largest pipe, the one she guessed connected to her apartment, its surface slick with condensation. As she moved deeper into the basement, the temperature seemed to drop, and she could feel her breath coming out in visible puffs. The air felt dense, as if something unseen was watching her, lurking just beyond the range of her flashlight. Samantha continued down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing eerily off the concrete walls. Just as she was about to turn back, a faint voice drifted to her ears. She froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. It was coming from further down the corridor, the same low whisper she had heard in her bathroom. Her name, repeated over and over, as if coaxing her deeper into the basement's bowels. Her stomach turned with a mix of fear and curiosity, but she couldn't stop herself. She moved toward the voice, each step heavier than the last. As she rounded a corner, the flashlight beam landed on something unexpected. A door, small and unassuming, hidden behind a cluster of pipes. She hadn't seen it before, despite having wandered the basement a few times. The door was old, its paint chipped and peeling, with a tarnished brass handle. It bore no label, no indication of what lay beyond. Her heart pounded as she reached out, hand hovering over the handle, half of her urging herself to turn back and forget this entire ordeal. But Samantha was too far gone. She had to know. She twisted the handle and pushed the door open, revealing a cramped room lit only by a dim, flickering bulb. Inside, the walls were covered in yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs. Her eyes darted from one clipping to the next, each headline more unsettling than the last. Missing tenant found in apartment after decade. One read, "Resident disappears. Last seen near stairwell." Each story seemed to tell of someone in the building who had vanished, all with eerie similarities to her own experiences. The photographs were even more disturbing, showing hollow-eyed tenants staring into the camera with haunted expressions. Then she saw it. Her own face, pinned among the others. It was a candid shot, taken from behind, as if by someone following her down the hallway. Beneath her photo, scrawled in red ink, was a single word, "Watcher." Her knees went weak, and she stumbled back, feeling as though the walls were closing in. She didn't understand what it meant, but the implication was clear. She was being watched, monitored like the others who had vanished. Was this some kind of warning or a prophecy of what was to come? Suddenly, a soft click echoed from behind her, and the door shut with a quiet finality. She rushed to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, shouting for help, but her cries were swallowed by the thick walls. Just as she was about to give up, she heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the hallway outside. She pressed her ear to the door, listening as the footsteps stopped just on the other side. Her heart raced, each beat reverberating through her chest. A quiet scratching sound began, as though someone were dragging their nails down the door, slowly and methodically. Samantha held her breath, backing away from the door, her eyes fixed on the handle as it began to turn, ever so slightly, twisting as if by an invisible hand. She was trapped, alone in a room filled with the faces of the missing, with no escape. Her mind raced, searching for any means of getting out, but there was nothing. No windows, no other doors, just the silent, oppressive walls and the growing realization that she was now a part of whatever haunted this building. Just as the handle twisted fully, she backed into a shelf, knocking over a pile of old records. Something metal clattered to the floor, and her eyes fell on a small, rusted key. Trembling, she snatched it up, jamming it into the lock with fumbling hands. The door swung open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. She ran, not daring to look back, her footsteps echoing as she made her way back to her apartment, heart pounding with the terror of what she'd just uncovered. When she finally reached the safety of her apartment, she locked the door behind her, sliding down to the floor, gasping for breath. She knew now that she was dealing with forces far beyond her understanding, forces that seemed intent on drawing her deeper into the heart of the building's mysteries. Her curiosity had led her to the edge, but she realized with a sinking dread that she might already be in too deep to escape. Samantha awoke the next morning, her body aching from the restless sleep that had done little to calm her nerves. The memory of the basement room, the strange photos, and the feeling of being watched haunted her. Despite the daylight streaming in through her windows, she couldn't shake the sense that she was no longer alone in her apartment, that the shadows themselves seemed to shift, moving just out of sight. She tried to busy herself, hoping to shake off the lingering unease, but her thoughts kept circling back to that room in the basement and the photograph of herself pinned to the wall. Desperate for some reassurance, Samantha decided to reach out to her neighbor across the hall, a retired professor named Mr. Bellamy. He was one of the few people in the building who had lived there long enough to know its history. Mr. Bellamy was a reserved man, rarely seen outside his apartment, but she'd spoken to him a few times in passing. He was always pleasant, though cryptic, often hinting at a dark past that he refused to elaborate on. Samantha suspected he knew more about the building's secrets than he let on. When she knocked on his door, there was a long silence before it creaked open. Mr. Bellamy peered out, his face lined with age and something else, anxiety. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as though he'd been expecting her visit. He gestured her inside without a word, closing the door behind her with a strange finality. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old books and a faint undertone of something metallic. She noticed stacks of papers on his table, as well as several old blueprints of the building, edges frayed and yellowed with age. As they sat down, she recounted her recent experiences, the messages, the voices in the pipes, the basement door, and the photos on the wall. Mr. Bellamy listened carefully, nodding as if he recognized each element, but he remained silent. When she finished, he sighed, his expression a mix of resignation and fear. "You aren't the first to experience these disturbances," he said quietly. "The building is more than just an apartment complex. It was designed with a purpose, a dark, hidden one that most would never understand." Samantha felt a chill settle over her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Bellamy explained that the building's architect, a man named Elias Wakefield, had been fascinated with esoteric symbols and rituals. Wakefield had been a recluse, obsessed with the idea of preserving souls. Rumor had it that he embedded certain rooms and hidden spaces with arcane symbols and designs, intending to trap the souls of the building's inhabitants. Wakefield's plans were never fully documented, but Mr. Bellamy had uncovered enough fragments to believe that Wakefield had succeeded. "The building," he said, "feeds off those who live here." Unsettled but curious, Samantha pressed him for details. Mr. Bellamy reluctantly shared what he knew. According to his research, each floor had a specific role, a kind of spiritual function within Wakefield's design. Some floors were designated to house certain types of souls, while others were meant to act as conduits, channels for energy. The 15th floor, he explained, was known as the Watcher's Floor, a place meant to observe and channel the energy of those above and below. It was no coincidence that Samantha had seen the mysterious figures in the windows on that floor. They were part of the building's design, guardians or prisoners, depending on how one looked at it. Samantha's skin crawled as she absorbed his words. Her initial curiosity about the building was now mingled with a sense of horror. Every unexplained noise, every shadow that seemed to move, felt like a symptom of the twisted network of souls trapped within the building's walls. Mr. Bellamy urged her to leave as soon as she could. Those who get too close to the truth are often the ones who disappear, he warned, his voice shaking. He looked at her with a sadness that felt final, as if he knew she might not survive what was coming. Despite his warning, Samantha couldn't bring herself to leave. Something was pulling her deeper, an almost hypnotic compulsion to unravel the mystery, no matter the cost. She thanked Mr. Bellamy and returned to her apartment, her mind racing with everything he'd told her. But as she stepped into her apartment, she felt a strange shift in the air. It was colder, and a subtle vibration seemed to pulse through the floorboards. She glanced around, feeling the walls closing in as if they were alive. That night, her sleep was plagued with vivid dreams. Images of corridors twisting and spiraling into endless darkness, of faces appearing in the walls, watching her with hollow eyes. She awoke several times, drenched in sweat, only to find herself staring into the shadows, half expecting to see one of the watchers standing over her bed. By morning, her nerves were frayed, and she felt more exhausted than when she'd gone to sleep. Determined to gain control of the situation, she decided to confront the building itself. She went down to the 15th floor, the floor of the watchers, feeling a mix of terror and determination. The hallway was deserted, with the same stale air and dim lighting as before. She walked down the corridor, stopping at each door, feeling for some kind of response, some sign that the watchers were aware of her presence. When she reached the door where she'd seen the figure, she hesitated before pressing her ear against it, listening for any sound from within. Suddenly, a faint knock echoed from the other side, mirroring her actions. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. The knock repeated, louder this time, like a rhythm summoning her. She stood frozen, torn between fleeing and confronting whatever lay beyond. Her hand moved almost involuntarily toward the handle, but she stopped herself, overwhelmed by a surge of dread. Instead, she backed away, heart racing, feeling the oppressive energy of the hallway closing in around her. As she retreated, she noticed that each door she passed now bore a mark, faint but unmistakable, a symbol scratched into the wood. It was the same symbol she'd seen on Wakefield's blueprints in Mr. Bellamy's apartment. A circle with intersecting lines, like a warped, twisted version of an eye. The realization hit her like a wave. The building was marking her, acknowledging her presence, as if it had chosen her as its next target. Samantha returned to her apartment, but the sense of safety she'd once felt there had evaporated entirely. The walls, normally lifeless concrete, now seemed to breathe, as if each surface were alive and watching her every move. She noticed subtle changes, the flickering of her lights, the faint sounds of scratching from within the walls, and a constant, barely perceptible hum that seemed to resonate deep within the building's structure. It was as if the entire edifice were slowly waking up, becoming aware of her presence. Determined to escape her mounting paranoia, she resolved to investigate further, convinced that knowledge might provide some control over her fears. She ventured back to Mr. Bellamy's apartment, but as she knocked, no answer came. She tried the door, finding it unlocked. Cautiously, she stepped inside. The once tidy apartment was now in disarray. Papers lay scattered across the floor, and the eerie blueprints had been ripped from the walls, with only fragments remaining. There were no signs of Mr. Bellamy, just the chilling realization that he had vanished without a trace. On the desk, she found a journal. Flipping through its pages, Samantha found detailed notes on the building's history, its design, and cryptic references to the cycle of awakening. Mr. Bellamy had written about past residents who had mysteriously disappeared, each vanishing after delving too deeply into the secrets of the building. According to his notes, these residents had all been drawn to the 15th floor, where they reported encountering visions, whispers, and sightings of the Watchers. Mr. Bellamy seemed to believe that the building consumed those who became aware of its true nature, feeding off their curiosity and fear. One passage stood out, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. Once marked, escape is nearly impossible. They come at night, silent and unseen. They are the shadows, the remnants, bound to this place. Once they choose you, you belong to the building. The words chilled her to her core, aligning too well with her recent experiences. As she read, a heavy dread settled over her, as if she were now trapped in an inevitable fate. Returning to her apartment, Samantha tried to convince herself that she could leave the building, that she was still free to escape. She grabbed her bag, her phone, and a few essentials, feeling a desperate need to flee. But as she reached the lobby, she noticed something strange. The exit door seemed further away, the hallway stretching longer with each step. She hurried, her footsteps echoing, but no matter how quickly she moved, the door remained maddeningly out of reach. Finally, in a moment of clarity, she stopped, realizing that the building itself was preventing her from leaving. The lobby felt like a trap, a dark, stretching tunnel with no end in sight. Panicked, she turned back toward the elevators, her only other option. But when she pressed the button, the elevator arrived already occupied. A man stood inside, his face obscured by shadow, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that felt suffocating. She hesitated, feeling the urge to turn back, but something inside her propelled her forward. She entered the elevator, the doors closing with an ominous silence. They rode in tense stillness, the air thick with an unspoken threat. As they ascended, Samantha felt her skin prickling, as if something unseen were brushing against her. The elevator stopped on the 15th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a hallway shrouded in darkness, the lights flickering ominously. The man remained silent, but his eyes never left her, his expression a blend of pity and warning. As she stepped out, he whispered one chilling phrase. "Once you're marked, they'll find you anywhere." The doors closed, leaving her alone in the suffocating dark. Samantha stood there, her heart pounding, feeling the heavy presence of something unseen, lurking just beyond her vision. Unable to resist, she moved down the hallway, the dim light casting elongated shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Every door she passed seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, and the symbols scratched into the wood emitted a faint glow, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She felt herself drawn toward the end of the hallway, where an open door awaited, leading into one of the rooms she had seen the figure in before. Inside, the room was barren except for a single chair facing the window. A figure sat there, unmoving, staring out into the city beyond. Samantha approached slowly, her steps hesitant, but the figure did not react. As she neared, she recognized the face. It was Mr. Bellamy, his skin pale, his eyes vacant. He didn't move or acknowledge her, his gaze fixed on the skyline with an unnatural stillness. She reached out, but as her hand hovered near his shoulder, he spoke, his voice hollow and distant. "It's too late, Samantha. You belong to them now." A wave of nausea washed over her as she backed away, the reality of her situation setting in. The walls around her seemed to close in, vibrating with a life of their own. She stumbled out of the room, feeling the gaze of countless unseen eyes upon her, watching her every move. The hallway twisted and shifted, as if the building itself were reshaping to trap her, turning her surroundings into a maze. Desperate, she ran, her footsteps echoing as the shadows seemed to coalesce around her. She could feel them closing in, brushing against her, cold and relentless. Her vision blurred, her breath ragged, until she found herself back in her apartment. She slammed the door behind her, her heart racing, her skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. As she leaned against the door, she heard a faint whisper, echoing from within the walls. "Once marked, there is no escape." Samantha knew then that Mr. Bellamy's warning had been more than just words. She was trapped, bound to the building's dark designs, just another resident caught in the web of Elias Wakefield's twisted creation. The thought lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that the building had claimed her, and no matter how hard she tried, she would never truly leave. In the silence that followed, she could feel the presence of the Watchers settling around her, shadows stretching and shifting, waiting patiently, knowing that she was theirs forever. Samantha's days began to blend together, each one more unsettling than the last. Time itself seemed to shift within the building, stretching or compressing in disorienting ways. Hours passed in seconds, or moments dragged on endlessly, leaving her feeling trapped in a constant haze of unease. She had tried everything to break the spell of the building, calling friends, packing bags, even attempting to run out in the dead of night. But each time, some invisible force steered her back. She began to feel as though her every movement was orchestrated, dictated by something greater than herself. The dreams worsened, becoming as vivid as reality. Every night, she wandered endless hallways filled with shifting shadows, hearing the faint murmur of voices calling her name. One night, she found herself standing in front of an enormous black mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling, its surface reflecting nothing but the deep, infinite dark. Just as she leaned closer to inspect it, a cold hand reached out from the void, pulling her into the glass. She awoke with a scream, drenched in sweat, but the sensation of the hand lingered, icy and visceral, as though it had crossed the boundary of the dream world into her waking life. Determined to escape this nightmare, Samantha began obsessively studying Mr. Bellamy's journal, trying to make sense of his warnings about the building's dark influence. She pored over his notes about the architecture, the symbols etched into the walls, and the theories about Wakefield's hidden designs. Her research led her to a peculiar entry near the back of the journal, where Mr. Bellamy had written about echoes, a phenomenon he believed was key to the building's haunting presence. According to him, the echoes were souls trapped within the building's walls, remnants of past residents who had been consumed by the entity controlling it. Their voices, he wrote, were a warning and a lure, a way to draw new residents deeper into the building's web. Desperate for answers, Samantha decided to confront these echoes directly. She began wandering the halls late at night, listening for any sound, hoping to hear the whispers she'd caught in fleeting moments. Her walks were unsettling, the silence thick, broken only by the occasional creak or the soft hum of the building's internal systems. On the 12th floor, she heard it, a faint, desperate voice calling her name. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to follow the sound, her feet moving as if pulled by a magnetic force. The voice led her to an old utility closet at the end of the hall, a place she had never noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, and as she approached, she saw faint outlines of old runes carved into the wood, symbols she recognized from Mr. Bellamy's notes. The air around her grew colder as she pushed the door open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell descending deep into the building's foundations. Samantha hesitated, but the compulsion to follow the voice was overwhelming. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, each footstep echoing hollowly as she descended into the dark. The stairwell spiraled downward for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with the smell of mildew and damp concrete. Finally, she reached the bottom, finding herself in a small, windowless room with stone walls. In the dim light, she could make out the shapes of strange markings and carvings covering every surface. It was a room unlike any other in the building, older and somehow more ominous. She felt a presence there, a sense of eyes watching her, invisible but undeniable. As she stood there, trying to make sense of her surroundings, she heard the voice again, closer this time. It was a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the walls themselves. She pressed her ear against the cold stone and listened. The voice was fragmented, like a radio signal struggling to come through. It said her name, repeated it, then fell silent. Her heart hammered as she waited, hoping for more, but the silence stretched on. Then, abruptly, the room was filled with a cacophony of sounds. Echoes of laughter, screams, and sobbing, all overlapping, a discordant symphony of trapped souls. The voices grew louder, swirling around her, filling her mind with images of pain and despair. Samantha saw flashes of past residents, their faces twisted in terror, their eyes wide with fear. They reached out to her, their hands clawing the air, desperate to escape the prison of the building. Terrified, Samantha stumbled back, feeling her head spin. She realized that the room was a kind of prison, a place where the souls of those who had succumbed to the building's power were trapped, held captive by the dark energy embedded in the walls. The voices began to coalesce into a single plea, each one begging her for freedom, urging her to find a way to break the building's hold on them. But how? She was as trapped as they were, another piece in the building's twisted design. Just as the voices began to fade, she heard one that stood out, clearer and stronger than the rest. It was Mr. Bellamy's voice, pleading with her. "Samantha, you must find the heart of the building. Destroy it and free us all." Before she could respond, the room fell silent, the voices retreating into the walls, leaving her alone in the cold, empty darkness. Shaken but resolute, Samantha made her way back up the stairs, her mind racing with questions. What was the heart of the building? And where would she find it? She returned to her apartment, feeling the walls pulsing around her, as if they were aware of her intentions. She could feel the building's resistance, a dark energy pressing down on her, trying to break her resolve. But she was determined now. She had to finish what Mr. Bellamy had started. She spent the next day combing through his notes, searching for any mention of the heart of the building. In a passage scribbled in the margins, she found a reference to a hidden floor, a place between levels, unmarked, unseen by any ordinary means. Mr. Bellamy had speculated that it was a hidden chamber, a space that housed the essence of the building's dark energy. It was this chamber, he believed, that anchored the souls, binding them within the structure. Samantha realized that finding this hidden floor was her only chance to escape, to put an end to the building's sinister power. She took one last look around her apartment, knowing that this journey might be her last. Clutching Mr. Bellamy's journal, she stepped out into the hallway, feeling the weight of the building's gaze upon her. With a final breath, she walked down the hall, toward the elevator that would take her to the hidden depths of the building, to face the darkness lurking within its heart. Samantha stood in the dim hallway, her fingers tracing the familiar elevator button. She knew that finding the hidden floor, the heart of the building, would be her only hope of freeing herself and the souls bound within these walls. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button, watching the elevator doors slide open with a metallic hiss. The interior seemed darker than usual, the light above flickering as she stepped inside, feeling the cold steel under her hands. She glanced down at the panel, which displayed the numbers of each floor. 20 floors, all in order, nothing visibly amiss. But she knew the hidden floor wouldn't be marked. According to Mr. Bellamy's journal, it was a place between floors, a secret chamber hidden in the shadows of the building's design. She tried pressing random combinations, hoping for a clue, but nothing happened. As she pondered her next move, she remembered something Mr. Bellamy had noted about the number 13, a floor erased from the building's plans to avoid superstition, yet still present in the architecture. Could it be hidden there? With a sense of growing anticipation, Samantha hesitated, then pressed the buttons for floors 12 and 14 simultaneously, her breath catching in her throat. The elevator shuddered, a low groan reverberating through the walls, as if the building itself were resisting her intrusion. She felt a strange sensation of movement, not upward or downward, but sideways, as though she were slipping into a space hidden from view. The air grew colder, and her skin prickled as the lights dimmed further, bathing the elevator in a sickly green glow. When the doors finally opened, she was met with complete darkness. She stepped out cautiously, her shoes tapping against what felt like old, cracked tiles. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of damp rot and mildew, like a space long abandoned. The faint, distant hum of machinery reverberated through the walls, a sound unlike anything she'd heard in the main floors above. She fumbled for her phone, switching on the flashlight, which barely cut through the dark. Shadows clung to every surface, resisting the light, as if alive and aware of her presence. As she ventured forward, she noticed that the hallway was lined with doors, each more decrepit than the last. marked with symbols she recognized from Mr. Bellamy's notes. Runes and strange carvings covered the surfaces, some scratched into the wood, others seemingly burned into the walls. Each door felt like a portal to another time, and with each step, she could hear faint whispers seeping through the cracks, fragments of conversations, laughter, and cries. She realized with a chill that these were voices from different eras, remnants of past residents lost to the building's curse. She paused before one door that seemed to vibrate with a particularly strong energy. Steeling herself, she pushed it open, revealing a small, candlelit room with peeling wallpaper and a single, worn-out chair. On the wall, a large mirror hung, its surface clouded with grime. She felt a strange compulsion to look into it, to see what lay hidden beyond her own reflection. As she stared, the glass began to clear, revealing not her face, but the image of a man staring back at her, his eyes hollow, filled with a deep, desperate sorrow. It was Mr. Bellamy. His lips moved soundlessly at first, but then his voice came through, weak and strained, as if echoing across a great distance. "Samantha," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You're so close. The heart lies beyond the threshold, past the rooms of the forgotten. But beware, the Watchers guarded. They are bound to the darkness, servants of the building's will." His face contorted with fear, his image fading until only her own frightened reflection remained. Shaken, she turned away, the feeling of unseen eyes pressing in around her. Continuing down the hall, she found herself approaching a large, iron door at the end of the corridor, one that exuded a sense of finality. She could feel the weight of something powerful behind it, a malevolent force, ancient and unyielding. The symbols etched into the iron were more intricate than any she'd seen, pulsing faintly as if alive. Samantha reached for the handle, but her hand froze. She could feel the presence of the Watchers nearby, an unseen audience drawn to her every movement. A whisper cut through the silence, chilling her to the bone. "Turn back, while you still can." But Samantha had come too far to retreat now. Steeling herself, she twisted the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark chamber that seemed to stretch far beyond the boundaries of the building. It was vast, cavernous, with walls that seemed to shift and breathe, shadows rippling like waves across a dark sea. At the center of the room, suspended in a column of flickering light, was a stone altar. Samantha stepped forward, her every instinct urging her to flee, yet something greater held her in place, a deep, inexplicable pull. The altar was covered in ancient symbols and carvings, each marking representing a soul lost to the building's hunger. Above it, suspended in midair, was a strange, pulsating sphere, dark and amorphous, as if made from the very essence of the building itself. She realized with a jolt that this was the heart, the core of the building's dark power, the source of its endless cycle of terror. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, filling her mind with fragments of stories, echoes of lives taken by the building's insatiable appetite. The Watchers emerged from the shadows, figures cloaked in darkness, their faces obscured, their eyes glowing faintly. They formed a circle around her, silent, watchful, and menacing. Samantha felt their gaze pressing down on her, a forcible stronger than her own, holding her in place, testing her resolve. She took a deep breath, reaching out to touch the heart, feeling its energy pulse against her hand like a living thing. The whispers intensified, the voices growing frantic, a chaotic symphony of fear and desperation. She hesitated, sensing the Watchers drawing closer, their shadows stretching toward her. Summoning all her strength, she pressed her hand against the surface of the heart, feeling it resist, as though trying to repel her touch. In that instant, a blinding light filled the room, and a cacophony of screams echoed around her, the souls of the trapped residents surging toward the heart, drawn by its power. The Watchers recoiled, their forms dissolving into the shadows, unable to withstand the force of the light. Samantha felt the building itself shudder, the walls groaning as if in pain, its dark power unraveling under her touch. With a final surge of strength, she pushed harder, and the heart cracked, splintering into fragments that dissolved into wisps of smoke. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the building's hold on her, and on the trapped souls, began to break. The Watchers vanished, retreating into the darkness, their purpose undone. Samantha felt a profound sense of relief as the chamber faded around her, leaving her standing alone in an empty hallway, the iron door behind her now sealed. Exhausted but victorious, she stumbled back toward the elevator, feeling the building shift as if awakening from a long, dark slumber. She knew she had disrupted the cycle, broken the curse, and freed the souls held captive within its walls. As she reached the elevator, she pressed the button, watching the doors slide open to reveal the familiar, warm light of the lobby. For the first time in days, she felt the building's gaze release her, allowing her to leave. With one last glance back, she stepped into the elevator, feeling the weight of countless lives lifted from her shoulders as the doors closed behind her, sealing the secrets of the building within its depths forever. Samantha stood outside the building, her eyes fixed on the looming structure. The once imposing figure now seemed almost benign, a quiet monument to the horrors she had faced and ultimately survived. The cold air of the early morning bit at her skin, but she felt an overwhelming sense of relief, freedom. The building was no longer a prison, its grip finally loosened. Yet, deep down, Samantha knew the battle was far from over. What had she truly unleashed? Was it all really over? Or had she merely scratched the surface of something far more insidious? As she walked away, her mind replayed the events of the past days like an endless loop. She had expected to feel victorious, to revel in the fact that she had ended the curse that had trapped so many before her. But instead, there was only emptiness, a hollow space that seemed to have opened inside her. The destruction of the heart had caused the building to tremble, to fight back against her. But had she really destroyed it, or had she merely freed it? The sphere she had encountered at the heart of the building. What was it? What had it been connected to? The more she thought about it, the more unsettled she became. Samantha had barely slept since the event, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her. She kept seeing fleeting glimpses of the Watchers, their dark forms lurking in the corners of her vision, and hearing whispers that no one else could. She wondered if they had truly been banished or if they were still watching her, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. Could the building's curse be transferred somehow? Could it follow her? Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, desperately trying to find any trace of information, but there was nothing. Nothing about the building's past. Nothing about the strange events that had transpired. It was as if the building had erased its own existence from the world. In the following days, Samantha tried to return to her normal life, but it was as if something had fundamentally changed. She could no longer trust her own mind. The ordinary world felt distant and surreal, as if the lines between reality and nightmare had blurred. She found herself staring at people on the street, wondering if they too had seen the shadows, felt the Watchers. It was as if the very fabric of existence had been altered, and Samantha was now a part of something much bigger than herself. One evening, weeks after her escape, Samantha found herself standing in front of a building that mirrored the one she had left behind. The architecture, the windows, the atmosphere, it was all too familiar. It was as though she had walked into the same building, yet something was off. The lights inside flickered with an unnatural rhythm. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest as she stood there, unable to move. A wave of nausea hit her, and she stumbled backward, her heart racing. The sensation was overwhelming, like the building itself was alive, aware of her presence. Confused and frightened, Samantha tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to her like a shadow. She had told herself that the nightmare was over, that the building had been purged of its dark power. But here it was again, in a different form, a different place. The same dread seeped into her bones, the same oppressive atmosphere choking her. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up as she turned to leave, only to find herself face to face with a figure she knew all too well. Mr. Bellamy. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and hollow, his clothes worn and tattered. His presence, though once comforting in the face of their shared knowledge, now seemed like a cruel reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Samantha tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. His lips moved in a slow, deliberate motion as if rehearsing something. Then finally his voice came, raspy and cold. "You didn't destroy it, Samantha," he said, his words dripping with regret. "You only disturbed it. The heart was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be contained. Now it has spread. It's out of the building, and it's coming for you." Samantha's blood ran cold. She took a step back, trying to process his words, but the reality of what he was saying hit her like a freight train. The building, the curse, wasn't confined to the walls of that structure anymore. It had followed her, infiltrated the world outside, and was spreading its influence. The Watchers weren't bound to the building. They were tied to something much older, more powerful, and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. As the words sank in, Samantha felt the ground beneath her tremble, just as the building had before. She looked around, expecting to see people reacting to the disturbance, but no one moved. It was as if the world had gone still, frozen in place by the building's reach. The realization hit her. This wasn't just her problem. This wasn't a local issue. The curse had grown, expanded, and now it was reaching beyond the borders of the building and into the very fabric of society. "What have I done?" Samantha whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt and fear. Mr. Bellamy's face softened, but only slightly. "There's still time to stop it, but you have to act quickly. The heart can be sealed again, but the key to that lies in understanding what you've awakened. You need to go back to where it all began, back to the original foundation." Samantha nodded, even though she didn't fully understand. The heart, destroying it, containing it, had been her goal, but now she saw the complexity of what had been unleashed. She had never considered the consequences, never imagined that her actions would send ripples far beyond the walls of the building. She had thought she was saving herself, saving others, but in doing so, she had disrupted the delicate balance that had kept the curse contained for so long. "I'll go back," she said, her voice steadying with newfound resolve. "But I need your help. I can't do this alone." Mr. Bellamy's eyes flickered with something. Perhaps hope, perhaps resignation. "I'll guide you, but know this. The building is no longer what it was. It's more than a structure now. It's a force, and it's coming for everything. We have to destroy it at its source, before it claims everything." Samantha didn't fully understand, but she knew one thing. The fight was far from over. The journey back to the building was not a decision Samantha made lightly. It was a call to confront the very thing that had altered the course of her life, the thing she had thought she had destroyed. The night she had first stepped inside the towering structure, she had felt a foreboding sense of dread, but nothing compared to the weight she felt now. The threat had grown, expanded beyond the building's walls, and into the outside world. Samantha had done what she thought was necessary to stop it, but the consequences of her actions had been catastrophic. The building loomed before her once again, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. It was no longer just a structure. It felt like a living, breathing entity, pulsating with an energy that she could feel deep in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the heart of the building, the source of the curse, was calling to her. Even as she stood before it, the air seemed to shimmer with a malevolent presence. It was as though the building had been waiting for her return, and now it was prepared to make its next move. Samantha stood at the base of the building, staring up at the towering height. She had never considered just how vast the structure was, how many secrets it could hold within its walls. As she turned to Mr. Bellamy, his presence felt oddly comforting, though his grim expression suggested that he too understood the gravity of the situation. "The heart is still in there," he said, his voice low, almost as if speaking aloud might draw unwanted attention. "But it's not the same heart you destroyed before. It has evolved. It feeds on fear, on chaos. You'll need to be ready for what lies ahead." Samantha nodded, but the uncertainty in her stomach gnawed at her. The idea that the heart had somehow adapted, morphed into something more dangerous than before, filled her with unease. Could the building really change in such a way? Could it evolve, as Bellamy suggested? The thought seemed incomprehensible, but she had seen enough of the supernatural world to know that anything was possible. They entered the building together, but it was immediately clear that things had shifted. The once familiar lobby, with its dim lights and sterile ambience, now seemed alien. The air felt thick, oppressive. Every step they took felt as though they were disturbing something ancient, something that had been waiting for them to return. The walls, once merely unremarkable, now seemed to pulse with an unseen force. It was as if the building itself were alive, aware of their presence, and ready to react to whatever they might do. Samantha's pulse quickened. As they ascended the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows seemed to shift at the periphery of her vision, and faint whispers echoed in the corridors, as though the walls themselves were speaking to them. Her earlier fears about the Watchers resurfaced. Had they returned? Were they now manifesting inside the building? Or was this some other form of malevolent presence? When they reached the 20th floor, the tension became palpable. The door to the heart was no longer where it had been. It was as though the building had moved it, as if it was deliberately preventing them from finding it. Samantha and Mr. Bellamy scoured the floor, moving quickly and quietly, trying to find any sign of the heart's location. They reached a small door at the far end of the corridor. It was covered in symbols strange and unsettling. They seemed to writhe, shifting and changing as Samantha's eyes tried to focus on them. "This is it," Bellamy whispered, his hand resting on the door. "This is where it all began." Samantha hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was it, the moment she had dreaded. The heart had to be destroyed, but the question remained. Could it be destroyed in the same way? Would the building let them finish what they started, or had the heart already taken steps to protect itself? With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, its walls covered in strange carvings and faint symbols of an ancient origin. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and a low hum filled the space. In the center of the room, suspended above the ground, was the heart, but it wasn't the same as before. The sphere that had once held an eerie, unearthly glow now seemed to pulse with a deeper, darker light. The air around it seemed to warp, as though time and space themselves were bending to the will of the heart. It had changed. The building had fed it, nurtured it, and in return, it had grown stronger. Samantha stepped forward cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. The heart seemed to recognize her, its pulsing glow shifting in response to her presence. She could feel it reaching out, trying to draw her in, to overwhelm her with fear and dread. It was feeding off her emotions, her anxiety. It was alive in a way that she hadn't understood before. Bellamy stood beside her, his face pale, his hands trembling. "It knows you," he said quietly. "It knows you're the one who destroyed it before, and it won't let you finish the job this time." Samantha's heart raced as she took another step closer to the heart. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing inward as though the building itself was trying to swallow her whole. She reached out a hand, but the closer she got, the more the heart's energy seemed to overwhelm her. It was too strong, too ancient. "What can we do?" Samantha whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't destroy it the way we did before," Bellamy said. "We need to seal it away again, but the key to doing that is understanding it, understanding its true nature." Samantha paused, confusion clouding her mind. "Its true nature?" Bellamy nodded. "It's not just a curse. It's a consciousness, a being that has existed long before this building. It was drawn here, bound to this place, but it is not confined to it. It exists in the very foundation of this world, and only by understanding that connection can we hope to bind it once again." The weight of his words hit Samantha like a tidal wave. This was no mere curse. It was something far more powerful, something ancient and primal. She had underestimated it, thinking that destroying it would be enough. But now she realized that she had only scratched the surface of something much larger than herself, something that threatened the very fabric of reality. The realization that the heart was not merely an object of malevolent power, but rather a conscious entity, sent a tremor through Samantha's body. She had thought that destroying the heart would be the end of it, that the curse would be broken, that the Watchers would be vanquished, and the building would lose its grip on reality. But Bellamy's words echoed in her mind. it is not just a curse. It is a consciousness, a being that has existed long before this building. Samantha had underestimated it. The heart was not a singular evil to be destroyed. It was a force that had existed long before the building was even constructed, and now it was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. The air in the room grew thicker, pressing down on her with an almost physical weight. The heart, which had once pulsed with an eerie glow, now seemed to radiate a deep, pulsating darkness. It was alive, sentient, and it was aware of Samantha's presence. The realization of its true nature left her feeling powerless. How could one fight something that existed beyond time, something that was not confined to the building or even this reality? The heart was not bound by the rules of the world she understood. Samantha's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything she had learned. If the heart had existed long before the building, then it was likely tied to something ancient, something much older than the structure that had contained it. But why had it come to this building? Why had it chosen this place to manifest? These questions lingered in her mind, but there was no time for answers. She had to act now. Bellamy stood beside her, his expression grim. "It's too late to destroy it, Samantha. That was a mistake. We can't fight it head on. It's too powerful. But there's one thing we can do. We can contain it again. But this time we need to bind it, not just with the building, but with the fabric of reality itself. We need to sever its connection to this world." Samantha looked at him, still struggling to understand. "How do we do that?" Bellamy's eyes flickered with something. Perhaps regret, perhaps a hint of fear. To contain the heart, we need to understand its source. Its power is tied to something older than the building, something older than any of us. We need to find the foundation of its existence. If we can sever that connection, we can trap it once more. The idea of trying to sever the heart's connection to reality felt like an impossible task. The building had become a fortress for the heart, a prison where it had grown, fed, and waited for a chance to escape. The heart wasn't just a curse. It was a parasite, thriving on fear, on chaos, on the very human emotions that made the building's occupants vulnerable. Samantha felt the cold tendrils of doubt creeping into her mind. How could she ever hope to sever the heart's connection to reality when she didn't even understand how it worked? She had thought that her actions in destroying the heart before had been enough, but now she realized that she had only scratched the surface of the horror that lay beneath. The heart was not just contained by the building. It was part of something much more insidious, something that had woven itself into the fabric of the world. "I don't understand," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. "How do we even begin to sever its connection?" Bellamy's face hardened. "We need to find the ritual that binds the heart to this reality. It's an ancient process, one that hasn't been used in centuries. But it's the only way to truly contain it." Samantha nodded slowly, the weight of what Bellamy was asking her to do settling heavily on her shoulders. A ritual? An ancient process? She was no expert in the occult, no scholar of ancient rites or forgotten histories. But if she had learned anything from her time inside the building, it was that knowledge, especially the dark, forbidden kind, was power. She turned to look at the heart once more. Its pulsating glow had grown more intense, more insistent, as if it were beckoning her closer, urging her to give in to the fear it was feeding on. But Samantha wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had come too far, endured too much. The heart may have grown stronger, but she had learned its nature. It thrived on fear, on human emotion, and as long as she could keep her mind clear, she could resist its pull. "We need to find the ritual," Samantha said, her voice steady now. "Where do we start?" Bellamy hesitated for a moment, as though considering the best way to answer her. "There's a library, a place where the knowledge of the building was kept, hidden away from those who might misuse it. It's in the basement, deep beneath the structure. If there is a ritual, it will be there." Samantha felt a chill run through her. The basement. The one place she had avoided since her first night in the building. The idea of returning there, to the heart of the darkness that had first trapped her, filled her with dread. But it was the only option. The library might hold the answers they needed to sever the heart's connection, to bind it once more and stop its influence from spreading further. "I'll go," Samantha said, her voice resolute. "We have to act fast. The longer we wait, the stronger it will get." With a final glance at the heart, which continued to throb with a malevolent rhythm, Samantha turned toward the exit. The building had become an unfamiliar landscape, twisted, corrupted, and alive with a force that seemed to bend reality to its will. Every step she took felt like a step into the unknown. She was no longer sure if she could trust her surroundings. The building itself seemed to watch her every move, its walls closing in on her, as though it were trying to prevent her from reaching the basement. Bellamy followed close behind, his footsteps silent on the cold floor. As they made their way down the corridors, the whispers grew louder, filling Samantha's ears with a cacophony of voices. They sounded like the Watchers, like the very voices of the building itself. She tried to block them out, focusing instead on the task ahead. The library was their only hope, and she couldn't afford to be distracted. As they approached the staircase leading to the basement, the temperature seemed to drop, the air thickening with an unnatural chill. Samantha took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. The ritual was their last chance. She couldn't afford to fail now. With one final glance at Bellamy, who gave her a nod of encouragement, Samantha descended the staircase. The door at the bottom of the stairs loomed before her, dark and imposing. She could feel the heart's influence intensifying the closer she got. She placed her hand on the handle, and with a steadying breath, opened the door. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, revealing the basement library. The air was heavy with dust and the scent of aged paper, mingling with something darker, something older. It felt as though the room had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world for decades, perhaps centuries. Samantha stepped inside, her every sense on alert. The stone walls of the library seemed to pulse with a quiet, malevolent energy, and the dim light from the single, flickering bulb overhead only accentuated the suffocating atmosphere. The floor was littered with old, forgotten books, some lying open as though their readers had left them abruptly. Their pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded to near illegibility. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with texts of various sizes, some bound in leather, others in strange materials that Samantha couldn't identify. She instinctively reached for the closest shelf, but as her fingers brushed against the dusty spine of one book, she recoiled. There was something wrong with it, something that made her skin crawl. Bellamy stepped into the room behind her, closing the door with a soft click. His eyes darted across the room, his expression tense. "We need to find the ritual quickly," he said, his voice hushed. "The heart's influence is already spreading. We don't have much time." Samantha nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She felt the weight of their mission pressing down on her, as though the building itself were conspiring against them. The heart, still beating in the depths of the building, was reaching out with tendrils of fear, and the library was its perfect extension. Every corner of the room seemed to hum with a malignant energy, like the very air was being tainted by its presence. She began to move between the shelves, scanning the titles of the books. Most were written in languages she didn't understand, their ancient scripts a mystery. Some were covered in dust, as though they hadn't been touched in years. It was as if the knowledge they contained had been purposely hidden away, left to rot and decay. But Samantha knew that this was where the answers lay. She had to keep searching. Bellamy, meanwhile, was examining a large, ornate desk at the center of the room. Its surface was cluttered with papers, old maps, and faded drawings. He seemed to be searching for something specific, his hands moving quickly as he rifled through the stacks of material. Samantha approached him, her curiosity piqued. She had never seen Bellamy this focused, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a sense of urgency that seemed to infect the entire room. "Find anything?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He looked up, his face grim. "There's a pattern to the ritual," he said, pushing a few pieces of paper aside to reveal a map of the building's layout. "It's all tied to the foundation. The heart is linked to the building's very structure, and the only way to sever that link is by performing the ritual at the core of the building itself." Samantha's stomach churned at the thought. The core of the building? It had to be the heart of the building, the very place where the entity had first been bound. But how could they possibly reach it now, with the heart's influence growing stronger by the second. She scanned the papers on the desk, hoping for more clues. Her eyes landed on a faded diagram, an illustration of the building's foundation, with intricate symbols drawn over it. These symbols looked almost like runes, their meanings unclear to her. She recognized some of them from her earlier encounters with the heart, but others were foreign, their power radiating from the page itself. This was it, the ritual they needed. There it is, Bellamy said, his voice low. The heart must be severed at its source. We'll need to perform the ritual right here, at the foundation of the building. These symbols are the key, but they won't be enough on their own. We'll need to gather certain objects, and we'll need to do it before the heart becomes too powerful. Samantha's heart raced as she read over the ritual. It was an ancient form of binding, designed to sever the connection between the heart and the world, to lock it away for good. But there was one detail that made her hesitate. The ritual required a sacrifice. It wasn't a simple act of sealing away the heart. It was a complex, dangerous process that would require someone to give up something precious, something that could never be reclaimed. What's the sacrifice? Samantha asked, already dreading the answer. Bellamy's face darkened. It doesn't specify, but I've seen this ritual before. It's not about a physical sacrifice, but something more personal. The heart feeds on fear, on human emotion. To sever its grip, we may need to give up something that binds us to this world, something that keeps us tied to the living. Samantha's blood ran cold. The price of stopping the heart's influence was far higher than she had anticipated. What could she possibly give up that would sever the heart's power and free the building from its grip? She thought of the people she loved, of the life she had left behind before coming to the building. Was she willing to give up everything to stop the heart? Bellamy's eyes met hers, and she saw the weight of the decision in his gaze. I know what you're thinking, he said softly, but this is the only way. We don't have a choice. If we fail here, the heart will consume everything, our world, our reality. The building is just the beginning. A heavy silence fell between them. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, the implications of their task slowly sinking in. There was no turning back now. The building had already taken so much from her. Her safety, her peace of mind, her sense of reality. Now it was asking for more. And yet, as much as it terrified her, she knew that if she didn't act, the heart would continue to spread, to consume everything around it. She turned her attention back to the ritual, focusing on the symbols and the steps outlined in the ancient texts. There was no time to second-guess herself. Bellamy was right. They had no choice but to proceed. But as she traced the symbols on the map with her finger, she realized that the ritual was not the only thing they needed to focus on. They had to contend with the building itself, the very foundation that had become a conduit for the heart's power. The air in the library seemed to grow heavier, the weight of the building's energy pressing down on them as they prepared to embark on a path that could lead to either salvation or destruction. Samantha had no idea what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. The heart's grip on the building would not be broken easily. She had to be ready to face whatever it took to stop it. The ritual was set, but there was still one thing standing between Samantha and the heart. The core of the building, the place where its power was the most concentrated. Despite the ancient texts, the symbols, and the map that Bellamy had uncovered, something about the building felt off, as though it were actively trying to fight them. Samantha had sensed it before, but now it was undeniable. The heart wasn't just waiting for them to fail, it was actively manipulating the space around them, warping reality in ways that defied understanding. The stairwell leading deeper into the building was at first unassuming. It was a narrow, dimly lit passage, framed by crumbling walls and covered in layers of dust. But as soon as they descended, the temperature dropped, and the air became thick, as though something unseen was watching them. Bellamy walked ahead, his steps purposeful yet hesitant, while Samantha trailed behind, trying to keep herself composed. Each floor they passed seemed darker than the last, and with every step, the sense of something pressing in on them grew stronger. The heart was close now, and the closer they got, the more she felt its influence. It's like it knows we're coming, Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. Bellamy's face was hard, his jaw set. It's not just knowing, it's anticipating. The heart's influence isn't just in the building. It's in us now, too. We can't outrun it. We can only keep moving forward. The stairs creaked beneath them, each step groaning with age and weight. It was as though the building itself was warning them, trying to halt their progress. But Samantha refused to let fear dictate her actions. They had come this far. They had to finish what they started. But as they moved further down, a strange sensation began to seep into the edges of her consciousness. It wasn't just fear. It was something far deeper, a profound sense of disorientation. The staircase began to twist and bend in ways that didn't make sense. What should have been a straight path now seemed to curve, turning sharply in unnatural directions. The walls on either side seemed to shift, as if the building itself was breathing, expanding and contracting with each breath she took. Samantha stumbled slightly as the stairs seemed to move beneath her feet, as if the very ground she was standing on had been replaced with something unstable. She reached out to steady herself, but the air felt thick, like walking through water. Her heartbeat quickened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is this?" she muttered, more to herself than to Bellamy. "This isn't right." Bellamy turned to her, his face pale but determined. "The building is shifting. It's using its power to manipulate perception. This isn't a normal stairwell. It's a manifestation of the heart's control, creating barriers to prevent us from reaching the core. We can't let it break us. Stay focused." But staying focused was becoming harder and harder as the stairs continued to twist. Samantha's mind felt like it was being pulled in different directions, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong now suffocating her every thought. She looked down at her feet and noticed that the stairs had begun to blur, each step now an indistinct mass of shadows and light. The deeper they went, the more the world around them seemed to stretch and pull, warping in strange and disturbing ways. "Do you see that?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. Bellamy didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed ahead. Then, slowly, he turned to her, his face pale. "I see it. It's a distortion in the space itself. The building is fighting back. We have to keep moving." Samantha felt a chill crawl up her spine. She could hear whispers now, faint and distant, as if the building itself was speaking to her. The whispers were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, like a voice she had heard before. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread gnawing at her. She couldn't afford to let the building manipulate her thoughts any further. But just as the whispering grew louder, she noticed something strange. A door, barely visible against the shifting walls, appeared at the bottom of the staircase. It wasn't part of the original design. It seemed out of place, as though it had materialized from nowhere, summoned by the heart's power. The door was made of dark wood, its surface carved with intricate symbols that matched the ones in the ritual. Bellamy seemed to hesitate, eyeing the door. "This is it," he muttered, more to himself than to Samantha. The entrance to the heart's domain. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the door had been waiting for them, as if it had known they would come. She felt an irresistible pull toward it, a sense of inevitability that seemed to lock her in place. With a trembling hand, she reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than anything she had ever felt before. As her fingers wrapped around it, the whispers intensified, growing louder, more insistent. She had to open the door. Without another word, she twisted the handle, and the door creaked open with a sound like bones snapping. Beyond it was a hallway, dark and narrow, the walls lined with more symbols, each one glowing faintly. The air was thick with a stifling sense of foreboding, and the further they ventured, the more the weight of the building's power pressed in on them. They could feel the heart's pulse now, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. But as they moved deeper into the corridor, the hallway began to stretch again, the walls seeming to elongate unnaturally, the ceiling bending inward. Samantha's mind began to unravel, the pressure mounting, the air too thick to breathe. Every step she took felt like it was leading her into an abyss, and yet there was no turning back. Finally, they reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood, larger than the others, adorned with more symbols, each one pulsing with dark energy. It was the entrance to the heart's chamber, and Samantha could feel its power radiating from the cracks around the door. The building was ready for them, but she had no idea what awaited them on the other side. As she reached for the door handle, a voice, clear and unmistakable, spoke from the shadows. "You're too late." The words echoed around them, reverberating through the walls, and for the first time, Samantha understood. This was no longer just about stopping the heart. It was about surviving it. The moment the voice spoke, the air around Samantha and Bellamy thickened, as though the very walls of the building were closing in on them. The faint, echoing voice wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, suffusing the very atmosphere with dread. Samantha's fingers froze on the handle of the door as she slowly turned her head toward the shadows where the voice had originated. Her heart raced, and she could feel the temperature in the hallway drop another few degrees. The building was more alive than they had ever realized. "You're too late," the voice repeated, this time clearer, as though the darkness itself had become the speaker. There was no distinct form from which the voice emanated, no figure or presence to pinpoint. Instead, it surrounded them, vibrating through the very fabric of the building, weaving itself into the walls. Samantha could feel the words crawl across her skin, like cold fingers running up her spine. The tone was mocking, certain, as though the entity knew something they didn't, something that had been waiting for this moment. Bellamy stood motionless beside her, his eyes scanning the room, his posture tense. Samantha could see the flicker of uncertainty cross his face, something she had never seen in him before. He was always the rational one, the man who believed that the heart could be destroyed, who had dedicated himself to finding a way to defeat the building's dark influence. But now, with his presence filling the air, he looked less sure of their chances. "This doesn't feel like the same building," Samantha murmured, her voice shaky. "It's alive. It's conscious, and it's aware of us. It knows what we're doing." Bellamy didn't respond at first. He simply reached out and pushed the door open with slow, deliberate movements, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. As the door swung inward, the room beyond was revealed. Not a chamber as they had expected, but an entire floor that seemed to stretch out endlessly. The space was vast, too vast for any normal building. The walls curved upward in an impossible spiral, the ceiling lost in an impenetrable blackness that gave no indication of height. It was as though they had stepped into another dimension altogether, a place where the laws of physics no longer applied. "Where are we?" Samantha breathed, stepping into the vast expanse, her words barely audible in the overwhelming stillness. The ground beneath her feet was soft, almost spongy, as though it was alive, pulsing with some unseen force. "We're inside it now," Bellamy said, his voice distant as he stepped forward. "The heart. The building isn't just a structure anymore. It's a living organism, a being that has existed for longer than we can imagine. And this is its core." As they ventured further into the floor, the air grew heavier, more suffocating. The walls seemed to shift as they moved, not in a natural way, but as if the building itself were watching them. The whispers, those persistent, insidious sounds, grew louder again, like thousands of voices speaking in unison, each one urging them to turn back, to abandon the mission. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the building's malevolent energy pressing on her from all sides. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the walls themselves were alive, closing in on them, pushing them toward the center of the floor. It wasn't just the heart of the building. They were being drawn into its very being, its essence. And the closer they got, the more Samantha could feel her mind beginning to crack under the pressure. The whispers had turned into disjointed images in her mind. Faces of people she had never met, places she had never seen. Every time she blinked, the images shifted, twisting into something worse, something darker. Then, through the mist of her thoughts, she saw it. At the center of the vast space stood what could only be described as a pulsing mass, its form fluctuating like a living heart. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The mass throbbed with a sickly, rhythmic pulse, as though it were drawing energy from the very air around it. The ground beneath it seemed to ripple in time with each beat, and the air hummed with an unsettling vibration. Samantha's gaze was drawn to it, unwillingly, as though it had become the center of her entire existence. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice quivering. "Is that the heart?" Bellamy didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the mass, his face pale and strained. He seemed to be fighting something within himself, struggling to keep his composure as the influence of the heart intensified. It was as though the mass were pulling at their very souls, coaxing them into submission, bending them to its will. For a moment, the building fell silent, as if it were holding its breath. Then the mass shifted, expanding and contracting, sending ripples through the air that distorted their vision. It was as though the very fabric of reality itself was warping around it. And for a brief moment, Samantha felt as though she might be torn apart by the force emanating from it. But as she looked closer, something strange caught her eye. There were shapes embedded within the mass, figures faint but unmistakable. Faces, people. It wasn't just the heart she was looking at. She was looking at a prison, at a repository of souls. It was as if the building had been trapping the lives of its inhabitants, feeding on their energy, their essence. And now, the heart was awakening, bringing the prisoners to the forefront, pulling them into its consciousness. "No," Samantha gasped. "It's feeding on them. On us." Bellamy's expression darkened as he stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if trying to touch the pulsing mass. "We have to stop it. We have to destroy it now, before it consumes everything." But before either of them could make another move, the ground beneath them began to shake. The building's pulse quickened, the vibrations reverberating through the floor, and the walls around them began to crack and splinter. The heart was no longer content to remain hidden in the shadows. It was fully awake now. It had been waiting for this moment, and in that moment, Samantha realized the true horror of what they were facing. It wasn't just the building they had to destroy, it was the very nature of the heart that they had underestimated. It wasn't a simple force. It was an ancient, sentient entity, and they were nothing more than its prey. The tremors in the building grew stronger with each passing second. Samantha and Bellamy could feel the ground beneath them begin to quiver, as though the entire structure was being pulled apart from within. The once silent corridors now echoed with the sound of cracks, as if the bones of the building were being split open. But the most unnerving part wasn't the shaking. It was the palpable sense of inevitability, of something far worse looming just beyond the edge of their understanding. The heart had awoken, and it was far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Bellamy moved first, his feet heavy on the shifting ground. "We need to get to the core," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "We can't stop it from here. We have to destroy the source." Samantha nodded, though a sense of dread gripped her chest. The mass at the center of the room pulsed in a sickening rhythm, like the beating of a heart in the body of a beast far too large for them to comprehend. With every beat, the building seemed to shrink, to contract around them. The walls no longer felt like barriers. They felt like they were alive, watching them, waiting. Samantha took a step forward, but the air seemed to thicken around her, making each movement feel like wading through tar. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just voices. They were visions, flashes of images from people long gone, faces that begged for release, eyes that held the terror of those who had been trapped for decades, if not longer. The building wasn't just a structure. It was a prison, and those souls had been its inhabitants for an eternity. But what was worse was the feeling that Samantha wasn't just seeing these faces. She was becoming them. Their fear, their anguish, began to seep into her mind, clouding her judgment, distorting her sense of reality. "We're running out of time," Bellamy said, his voice cutting through the fog of confusion. "We need to get closer." He reached out and gripped her arm, pulling her back from the edge of the building's central mass. "Stay focused, Samantha. Remember why we're here." Samantha clenched her jaw, trying to push the visions aside. She needed to stay grounded, to remember that they were fighting to end this nightmare, to stop the heart from consuming everything around them. They were close, too close, in fact. The mass at the center of the room now seemed to respond to their movement. its pulsations growing more erratic, as if aware that they were trying to reach it. But Samantha couldn't shake the sense of dread that continued to claw at her insides. They had been here before, in this very place, but everything felt different now. The building had evolved since their first steps into its cursed halls. It was more than just a structure. It was a force, a consciousness, and it knew them. It understood what they were trying to do. "We're not just fighting the building anymore," Samantha said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. "We're fighting it all. The heart is not just a heart. It's a source of power, of life, of something darker than we could have imagined." She paused, her eyes widening as she suddenly understood. "It's feeding off of us, off of our fear, our doubt. The more we resist, the stronger it gets. That's why it's controlling us. It's using our fear to gain strength." Bellamy's face tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward again, his face set in determination. "We don't have a choice. We have to destroy it now." The room seemed to respond to his words, the heartbeat of the building quickening. It was almost as though the heart had heard them, understood them, and it reacted in a wave of energy that sent a shockwave through the room. The walls cracked further, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. The mass at the center, once faintly glowing, now flickered with an ominous light, as though it were drawing strength from the chaos it had unleashed. Samantha could feel the energy building in her chest, a pressure that threatened to crush her. And then the floor beneath them began to disintegrate. Slowly at first, then faster, the concrete crumbling away as though it were nothing more than sand, revealing a void beneath. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward. She grabbed Bellamy's arm to steady herself, but it was useless. The ground was falling away beneath them. "No," she shouted, pulling him toward the distant safety of the walls. But it was already too late. The floor beneath them was gone, the entire structure giving way to an abyss that stretched down endlessly, swallowing the light. The mass in the center seemed to pulse more rapidly, drawing the building into its depths, as though it were preparing to devour everything in its path. "Stay close," Bellamy yelled over the roar of the collapsing building, his voice barely audible in the growing storm of destruction. They had to move, had to reach the heart before it consumed them too. Every instinct in Samantha screamed to flee, to escape the overwhelming force that threatened to pull them under. But she couldn't, she wouldn't. They were so close, too close to fail. The mass at the center of the room began to move toward them now, its surface rippling with a grotesque, liquid-like motion. It was no longer just a heart. It was an entity, a being of living darkness. And as it reached out, Samantha felt her very essence tug toward it. The building's pulse reverberated through her body, and for a moment, she was no longer sure if she was Samantha or something else entirely. The force of the heart was pulling at her consciousness, trying to merge with her, to consume her. But in that moment of terrifying clarity, Samantha understood. She understood what needed to be done. It wasn't about destroying the building. It was about breaking the cycle. The heart was alive because it fed off the souls trapped inside the building, the people who had come before them, those who had been consumed by it. They weren't just fighting a physical structure. They were fighting an endless hunger, an insatiable void that had been feeding for centuries. With a final, desperate cry, Samantha reached out. The building's walls closed in, the darkness pressing against her. But her mind remained fixed on one singular thought. The heart had to be destroyed. This had to end. And with that realization, she gathered every ounce of strength she had left and plunged herself into the heart of the building, into its very essence. Samantha's world shattered into a cacophony of sound and sensation. She had plunged into the heart, into the very center of the building's malignant consciousness. But instead of the expected sensation of annihilation, she found herself enveloped in something much worse, a vast, swirling void of endless despair. It was as though she had become a part of the building itself, her body dissolving into the very essence of its dark power. The pulsing rhythm of the heart was no longer just a beat. It was the breath of the structure, and it was inhaling her soul, pulling her deeper into its grip. The air around her was suffocating, thick with the weight of the building's millennia of suffering. The walls, the floors, the ceilings, they were all gone now. There was no distinction between reality and nightmare. Samantha could no longer tell if she was still standing or if she had already fallen into some kind of trance, a limbo where time and space lost all meaning. The heartbeat continued, thudding in her mind with a hypnotic, maddening rhythm. She tried to move, but her body felt as though it was being stretched thin. Every effort to escape, to reach back to the real world, felt futile. But then, through the fog of confusion, something familiar tugged at her. The sound of Bellamy's voice. His words were faint, distorted, but they cut through the darkness like a beacon. "Samantha, you have to fight it. You're still in control. You have to remember why you're here." The recognition of his voice anchored her, and with it, a jolt of clarity surged through her. Bellamy's presence, his will, reached across the abyss that had formed between them, reminding her that there was still a chance. There had to be. She focused on the sound of his voice, allowing it to guide her through the suffocating fog. It was all too easy to fall into the temptation of giving up, to let the building's consciousness swallow her entirely. But that was not an option, not anymore. Samantha reached deep within herself, summoning every ounce of willpower to push back against the crushing force. She didn't know how long it took. Time no longer seemed relevant, but eventually, she felt her limbs moving again. Her hands, once paralyzed by the darkness, now stretched out in front of her, as though searching for a way to grip onto something solid. The pounding of the heart, the building's oppressive weight, continued to press down on her. It was as if it were trying to crush her very existence into nothingness, to erase her identity entirely. But she could still feel it. Bellamy's presence, a thread of hope in the chaos. With renewed determination, she fought to push through the darkness, her body slowly reassembling itself as she struggled against the building's pull. The heart beat louder now, more insistent, but so did her heartbeat, steady and strong, refusing to falter. Each pulse of the building's energy now felt like a test of her will. And then, like a sudden spark in the void, the room around her shifted. The swirling darkness began to recede, the walls of the building slowly reforming, as if reacting to her defiance. She was back, standing on the floor of the central room again, though everything was distorted, twisted in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The heart was still there, pulsing with an otherworldly light, but now it seemed different. Less like an entity and more like a lifeless machine. Samantha's mind raced. She had somehow managed to disrupt its hold on her. But the battle was far from over. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed in her mind, cold and unyielding. "You cannot defeat me, Samantha. You have come this far, but your efforts are futile. The heart of this building is eternal. The more you resist, the stronger I become." Samantha clenched her fists, refusing to let the voice penetrate her resolve. The words were meant to weaken her, to make her doubt herself, but they only fueled her determination. She wasn't just fighting a building anymore. She was fighting the very essence of suffering and despair, a force that had haunted this place for as long as it had existed. The heart was feeding on fear, on despair, and it would continue to do so unless she found a way to sever its hold. The air around her crackled, the energy building again, and she knew that she was running out of time. Bellamy's voice was still there, a faint whisper in the distance. "Samantha, you have to end it. This is the final choice. You can't let it consume you." And that was when the realization hit her. The heart wasn't just feeding off fear. It was feeding off choice. The power it held wasn't in its heartbeat, its rhythm, or even its ability to control the building. It thrived on the very choices the people made in this place. Their desperation, their reluctance to act, their fear of the unknown. The heart had become an eternal force because it preyed on their hesitation. Samantha and Bellamy hadn't just been fighting a supernatural force. They had been fighting their own inaction, their own fear of the unknown. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. This was it. She didn't need to destroy the heart. She needed to stop feeding it. She needed to choose, to take the final step and make the ultimate sacrifice. The choice wasn't just to fight the building, but to free it from the cycle of suffering. She would have to sever the thread that bound her to the heart to break the cycle that kept the building alive. With a final, resolute breath, Samantha stepped forward, extending her hands toward the heart. The mass of darkness recoiled slightly, sensing her determination. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough to simply fight back. She had to let go of everything: the fear, the doubt, the hesitation. In that moment, she let go, and the building began to crumble. Slowly at first, as though unsure of its own destruction, then faster, the walls splitting open, the floors disintegrating. The heart flickered, its pulsing growing weaker, until finally it stopped altogether. The heartbeat, the life force of the building, fell silent. The collapse was sudden, as if the building itself had been holding its breath for centuries. But Samantha didn't feel fear. She felt peace. She had made her choice, and in doing so, she had freed the building and herself from its endless cycle. Samantha's victory over the heart had come at a high cost, one that she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The building, once so vast and unyielding, had collapsed in on itself. The structure was no longer the towering monstrosity it had once been. Its form dissolved into the ether, leaving behind only fragments of memories and echoes of pain. The air around her was heavy with the remnants of the building's dark past, and as she stood amidst the ruins, she felt a strange sense of loss, not for the building, but for the countless souls who had once inhabited it. The place had been more than a structure. It had been a mirror of human suffering, a repository of every fear, every regret, and every unspoken wish. But something else lingered in the air, something that felt like a presence. It was subtle at first, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, like a memory that wasn't her own. As she stood amidst the wreckage, her eyes scanning the destruction, a realization began to take hold. The building's collapse had not been the end of its story. It had simply been a chapter closing, one that would lead to something else. Samantha had freed herself, but in doing so, she had released the echoes of the past, the ghosts of all those who had once walked the building's halls. These echoes now surrounded her, and she could feel their presence in every corner of the void she had created. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the overwhelming sense of being watched. It wasn't just the building itself that had been alive. It was the people who had lived and died there, their spirits tethered to its every brick. Each floor, each room had a story, a history filled with unspeakable moments and tragic endings. But now, with the heart gone, those stories were free to resurface. It wasn't just the building's malevolent energy that had been silenced. It was the souls that had been trapped within it, bound to its form. And they were angry. The first whisper was a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Samantha turned, scanning the empty space around her. The walls had disappeared, replaced by an endless void that stretched out in every direction. There were no longer the towering walls of steel and concrete, no longer the familiarity of the building's floors. But the voice, it was unmistakable. She recognized it immediately. "Help us," the voice pleaded, the words tinged with desperation. "You freed us, but now we are lost. We cannot find rest." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone in this space. The spirits of the building were still here, lingering, their consciousness trapped in this liminal space between the world of the living and the afterlife. She could feel their eyes upon her, each one seeking release, each one demanding closure. She had freed the building from its torment, but now, it seemed, the torment had been passed on to the souls who had once inhabited it. They were caught in an endless cycle of pain, unable to move on. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Samantha whispered into the void. "I thought I was freeing you." Another voice answered, but this one was colder, more resentful. "You think you freed us? You've only made things worse. You've broken the cycle, but you haven't released us. We are bound to this place, and now, we are nothing but echoes." The words hung in the air, the bitterness of them sinking into her skin. Samantha had never expected her actions to be so complicated. She had thought that by destroying the heart, she would sever the building's hold over its inhabitants, but she had underestimated the depths of its power. The building was not just a physical structure. It was a prison for souls, a place where the past and present collided. The ghosts were not simply trapped by the building. They were its creation, its product, its very reason for existence. Without it, they had no purpose. They were adrift, lost in the void. Samantha's mind raced. What could she do? She couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she had to try. She had to find a way to give these souls the release they deserved, the peace they had been denied for so long. The choice she had made had been difficult, but it wasn't the final choice. There was still more to be done. "I can help you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "I can't change what happened, but I can help you find peace. Just tell me how." For a moment there was silence. The air was still, and Samantha felt the weight of the spirit's collective gaze upon her. Then, slowly, a response came, a whisper that seemed to come from all around her. "You cannot save us. Not all of us. Some of us are beyond redemption. But if you can release the last of the heart's power, we can be free. You must find the final piece of the puzzle." Samantha's mind whirled. The last piece of the puzzle? What did that mean? She had destroyed the heart, hadn't she? She had severed its grip on the building, on the souls that had been trapped. But there was still something she had missed, something she hadn't fully understood. A flash of memory hit her. She remembered the strange markings on the walls, the symbols she had seen throughout the building. They had never seemed important, but now she understood. The symbols were not just decoration. They were keys, each one representing a part of the heart's power. If she could find the missing piece, the key to the last part of the heart, perhaps she could finally release the souls. But where was it? Where had she missed the final clue? The answer came in a sudden rush, a vision of the building before its collapse. She saw the central room, where the heart had once pulsed with life. And then she saw it, a hidden door tucked away in the shadows. It had been there all along, unnoticed, concealed by the darkness of the building's power. Samantha knew that if she could reach that door, she would find the final key. The room around her seemed to shift again, as though the building itself were reacting to her thoughts. The spirit's whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging her to hurry. The final piece was within her reach, and only then could she give them the peace they so desperately sought. Samantha's steps were hesitant, but the sense of urgency burning within her pushed her forward. The whispers of the spirits continued to echo through the empty space, now a cacophony of voices, pleading for release, for peace. It was clear that the collapse of the building had not marked the end of her involvement in its twisted story. Instead, it had become the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter she had never anticipated but could not ignore. The last door, hidden in the shadow of the building's former power, had become her only hope. If she could find it, unlock it, perhaps she could undo the damage she had wrought and offer these lost souls the release they deserved. But what exactly lay behind this final door? Samantha had come to understand that the building was not merely a structure. It was a sentient entity, a manifestation of the darkness that lived within the human soul. Each floor, each room, was a fragment of history, a piece of the past that had coalesced into something far more sinister. The heart, once the source of its malevolence, was gone, but the essence of the building, the weight of its legacy, lingered. To truly free the souls trapped within, Samantha had to face the heart's last echo, the final fragment of its power. The memories of the building still pulsed in her mind, the images of the people who had lived and died within its walls playing like a broken reel of film. She could see their faces, twisted in fear, regret, anger, all the emotions that had fueled the building's darkness. Samantha had learned that it was not just the physical heart of the building that had caused its torment, but the emotional weight carried by the souls who had once called it home. They had been trapped by their own unresolved emotions, their own pain, their own choices. To free them, Samantha had to find the key to that emotional prison. As she walked through the void, the space around her began to shift. The shadows deepened, the walls reappearing in fragmented forms, each one representing a different memory, a different person, a different piece of the building's tortured history. She could feel the pull of the door now more strongly than ever. It was not just a physical door. It was a symbol, the final threshold between the past and the future, between the dead and the living. Behind it lay the key to the building's ultimate release, or its eternal damnation. The door materialized before her, its surface marked with the same strange symbols she had seen throughout the building. The symbols were more than mere decoration now. They were the building's language, a language of power, of control. Samantha recognized that each symbol represented a part of the building's complex soul, a fragment of its fractured identity. She had seen the heart's pulse through these markings, felt its presence in the cold walls, and now she understood that these symbols were not just codes. They were warnings. Warnings that once she opened the door, there would be no turning back. The whispers grew louder as she reached for the door handle. Some voices cried out for her to stop, to turn away, to leave them in peace. Others urged her forward, promising that freedom lay beyond. Samantha hesitated, a final moment of doubt lingering in her mind. What if she was wrong? What if opening this door would unleash something far worse than the building itself? But as she touched the handle, a strange calm washed over her. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. The decision had been made long before she ever set foot in the building. This was her purpose, her burden to bear. And now, she would face it. The door creaked open with a sound like the groaning of the building's bones. Samantha stepped through, and the world around her seemed to distort. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and repressed emotions. The room she found herself in was unlike any other she had encountered. It was neither part of the building nor a place in time. It existed outside the laws of reality, suspended in a state of pure essence. The walls were covered in the same symbols she had seen throughout the building, but here they seemed alive, shifting and pulsing with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it lay a small, unassuming object, a mirror. Its surface was cracked, the fractures running like veins across its glassy surface. But as Samantha approached, the mirror's surface shimmered, and for a moment, she saw a reflection not of herself, but of the building, a perfect, unbroken version of it. She saw the faces of the people who had once lived there, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths open in silent screams. Their lives had been stolen by the building, and now, their souls were trapped in its wake. The mirror was the last piece of the puzzle. It was the final artifact of the building's power, the key to understanding its hold over the souls trapped within. Samantha reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed the glass, a surge of energy pulsed through her, and she was overwhelmed by a flood of images, memories of the building's history, the people who had suffered within its walls, the darkness that had taken root. She saw the heart pulsing in the depths of the building, its energy feeding off the pain and fear of the souls it trapped. She saw the choices they had made, the lives they had lived, and the inevitable consequences that had followed. And then she saw herself. Samantha's reflection in the mirror was not the woman she knew. It was a distorted version of herself, her eyes darkened with the same sorrow and pain that had infected the building. She saw her own fears, her own regrets, the moments of her life that had brought her to this place. The building had not merely trapped the souls of its inhabitants. It had trapped her as well. She had become part of the building's story, her fate forever intertwined with its own. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. To free the souls, she would have to free herself. The building had been a reflection of her own inner turmoil, her own struggles with her past, her own unresolved pain. She had come to the building seeking answers, but what she found was a mirror of herself, broken, fractured, and in need of release. Samantha knew that in order to break the cycle, she would have to confront the darkest parts of herself, the parts she had been running from her entire life. With trembling hands, she reached into the mirror, her fingers brushing the surface of the glass. The room around her seemed to fade, and for a moment, she was no longer in the building. She was standing in the middle of her own past, facing the choices she had made, the paths she had taken, and the person she had become. She had to face the truth about herself before she could free the souls of the building. And in that moment, she understood. The door she had opened was not just a door to the building's heart. It was a door to her own. Samantha stood before the mirror, the very object that had brought her here, and the object that held the key to the final release. She understood now, with painful clarity, that the building's horrors had never been just about the architecture, the cold walls, or the long corridors that twisted in on themselves. It had always been about the unresolved emotions that festered within its heart, about the darkness that lived in every soul that had passed through its doors, including her own. The building had not merely been a prison for the dead. It had been a mirror of their torment, and perhaps even more unsettling, a mirror of her own. To destroy it, she had to destroy the part of herself that had allowed it to thrive. As Samantha reached out, her fingers hesitating at the edge of the mirror's shattered surface, she felt the full weight of her journey. The visions, the whispers, the ever-present cold. These were not external forces. They were fragments of her past, shadows of her own soul, replaying the decisions she had made, the guilt she had carried, and the mistakes she had never forgiven herself for. The building was a manifestation of her struggle to accept the things she could not change, the paths she had walked, and the ones she had abandoned. And in that final moment, she knew what needed to be done. She had to forgive herself. Her hand trembled, but the decision was clear. Samantha's reflection in the broken mirror wavered and shifted, showing the many versions of herself she had hidden over the years. Versions of herself that had tried and failed, the parts of her that had sought redemption but never truly found it. She saw the young woman filled with ambition, the mother who had abandoned her family, the lost soul who had sought solace in places that only deepened her despair. Each version of herself stood before her, their eyes filled with sadness and longing. The time had come to accept them all, to accept that they were part of who she was, part of the story that had led her here. The building groaned around her, as if acknowledging her decision. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows deepened, drawing closer. It was as if the very foundation of the building was beginning to crumble, its grip loosening. Yet, Samantha did not flinch. For the first time in her life, she felt no fear. The fear that had controlled her for so long. The fear of facing her own darkness, the fear of the unknown, had finally dissipated. She had made peace with herself, and in doing so, she had made peace with the building. There was no more need to run from the ghosts of the past. She had faced them, and now she was free. The mirror in front of her cracked further, the fractures deepening with every breath. The spirits of the building, who had once whispered in the dark corners, now stood in silent reverence, watching as she took her final steps. They no longer screamed, no longer begged for release. They understood. They knew what Samantha was doing. She was not only releasing herself, she was releasing them too. The pain of their existence had been tied to the very essence of the building. But now, as she forgave herself, she also forgave them. She had become their salvation. The cracks in the mirror spread like wildfire, and for a moment, Samantha was unsure if she had made a mistake. But then, with a sudden and violent shudder, the mirror shattered completely. The room around her seemed to dissolve, as if it were being unraveled thread by thread. The building groaned in agony, but there was something else, a sense of finality. The weight of years of suffering, of fear, of unresolved emotions, all came to a halt in that single moment. It was as if the entire structure had exhaled, releasing a breath it had held for decades. The spirits, no longer bound to the building, began to fade, their forms dissipating into the air like smoke, leaving behind an eerie but peaceful silence. Samantha, standing in the epicenter of this unraveling, felt the shift in the air. The tension that had once pressed on her chest, the invisible weight that had dragged at her every step, was gone. It was as if the building had exhaled, its heart no longer beating, its soul no longer fighting. It was free, and so was she. The fragments of the past, the pain, the guilt, the regret, they no longer had power over her. She had released them. She had chosen to move on. The building was no longer the monstrous entity that had consumed her mind. It was simply a structure, old, broken, but no longer haunted. It stood in silence, as if it too had come to terms with the weight of its past. The rooms were empty, devoid of the echoes that had once filled them. The darkness that had once pervaded every corner now seemed hollow, as if it had been absorbed by the very fabric of the place. The building had been a prison, but now it was just a memory, a faded scar that would eventually fade with time. Samantha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the air shift around her. The finality of her decision settled in her bones. She had come to the building with a single purpose: to uncover the truth, to understand the darkness that had trapped so many, including herself. What she had found was not just the building's secret, but her own. She had faced the shadows that had haunted her for years and had come out the other side, unbroken. As she turned to leave the space behind her, the building began to disintegrate around her, as if it were being slowly erased from existence. The walls crumbled to dust, the floors buckled and collapsed, the ceilings gave way. The building, once a fortress of darkness, had begun its final collapse. But Samantha didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had faced its heart. She had faced her own heart. And in doing so, she had released them both. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the mist, casting light on the ruins. The city, quiet as it had been for years, seemed to breathe a little easier. The weight had lifted. The ghosts were gone. The building was no more. And Samantha, standing in the soft morning light, knew that it was time to walk forward, into a future she had finally made peace with.